With the release of Season 2, we will get a complete overhaul on how vulnerable and critical strike damage is going to work. Basically, the bucket stuff that we had before and the multiplicative stuff between those buckets is basically going to be broken up. And this is how it is going to work. Let me get into the numbers here. I'm going to explain it thoroughly, but pretty fast. So bear with me here. We will also have some new mechanics that are going to be added into the game that will offset these changes. But first, we will have to understand the math first. So let's go ahead. Let's imagine before Season 2, so at the moment, you would hit for 1000 damage. Let's say you would also have a 300% vulnerable multiplier on your gear, basically summed up on your character. And you would also have 150% critical strike damage on top of that. Then your character also has an additive amount of damage. So for example, damage to close, or if you're a rogue, damage with cutthroat. So 200 of each of these, equaling 400. That would be a total damage with that one hit that was 1000. That one is now 50,000 damage in total. That is before Season 2 with the current state of the game. Now let's see how it's going to work as soon as the patch launches on October 17th, or the season launches. Now, we do have the same character, nothing changed, no gear, no nothing. You log in on your, for example, Eternal character, and this is the damage that you would deal. You would still hit for, we would still assume a normal damage of 1000 with just one hit, but now the only multiplicative damage is going to be 20% from vulnerable and 50% from your crit damage. Everything above that, so the difference between this vulnerable and this vulnerable, are these 280 vulnerable. These will now be going into the additive bucket. This is why you also see the additive bucket being 380 more than it was before. Because everything that is over those 20% in the vulnerable bucket, so 280, and above 50% in the crit damage bucket, which is 100, are going straight into the additive bucket now. As you can see here, we still have the damage to close with 200, we still have the damage with cutthroat on 200, but again, these 280 left over or above the cap are being added to the additive, and so is the 100 crit damage left over the 50 to the additive bonus. Now, how much damage would you actually do? If we change the color here, you can see that the damage loss is going to be tremendous. We're going down from 50,000 damage to, let's say, 16k. That is actually a difference of, let's say, around 32%. So you're now only dealing 32% of the damage that you were dealing before the change or before Season 2 has started. As you can see, the player power goes down tremendously, but that is actually not a big deal because the Blizzard developers have been thinking about this and they came up with this solution right here. Namely, they are going to adjust the power levels of the monsters to that new player power. So you can still kill the monsters just about as quickly as we were doing that in Season 1. Mixing damage will still be powerful, but less mandatory for all builds. This means that builds like dot builds or overpower builds will be much more competitive than they were before. So if we go back to the numbers here and we imagine that you are a build after Season 2 that doesn't really have 100% uptime for vulnerable and doesn't really crit that much. So for example, a dot rogue comes to mind, or maybe some blight necromancers. They don't really crit and they don't really scale that crazy with vulnerable. For them, this is going to be extremely good because they are going to focus on just getting that minimum amount of scalable or multiplicative damage, which is going to be instantly granted the second you're going to make an enemy vulnerable, because whenever they are vulnerable, they will already have those 20% more damage taken. Same goes for crit. damage. You actually don't need any crit damage, because whenever you are critting, you're already getting 50% more damage. So even if you have 1% crit and you're critting, then you will have those 50% crit damage, even if you don't have any crit damage on your gear whatsoever. So naturally, the builds that actually don't go for these stats are now going to get a free multiplier basically on top of their damage. So how would this look? Imagine you have been a build that has been going into VULN and crit, and you now had those 280 or 100 that are basically too much or above those multipliers. You can now instead take those and throw them on other stuff, such as, let's say, physical damage. Yeah, there's a lot of physical modifiers that you can, for example, take. And these would have, let's say the other one would be poison damage or something like that. These would be much more reliable for you to actually activate, because you will always deal physical damage as a Twisting Blades rogue, for example. So this is going to be much easier to sustain and get the additive damage bonus than if you basically don't make the enemy vulnerable, for example. On a Twisting Blades rogue, that's not going to happen. That's a bad example, but I hope you get my point. It is much more feasible to go for other stats now, because the activation of these stats is going to be much easier than vulnerable and crit. So to tie this all up, if you have a hard time critting or making the enemy vulnerable, you will just get a vulnerable skill on your bar to get a 20% free modifier, or you can also forego this and then instead invest into other stats that you will have active all of the time. For example, damage too close or damage with cutthroat, physical damage, poison damage, stuff that is basically always active. Now on top of that, we will also get a new type of multipliers. I will have the victimize passive here, and we will also have another example after this one. This victimize passive has now gotten a new text, and it also says victimized damage is increased by 120% of your vulnerable damage bonus. As you can see, the current damage increase is 24%. This means the character that has this victimized passive equipped right now only has a baseline of vulnerable damage, because 120% of that is going to be 24%. So as you can see here, if you would take that passive and you would specialize in dealing a lot of victimized damage, then it would be very beneficial for you to actually scale your vulnerable damage even higher. Basically, you would still go the route of stacking vulnerable damage on your gear, because if you would have 300% vulnerable damage, as we have seen in the example before, then Victimize would actually get a 360% damage increase. Not overall and not multiplied on your damage, but just that Victimize proc in itself. And now the second example, we see Blood Rage from Barbs. They are going to scale the Blood Rage with the damage that they are doing while berserking. As you can see here, that current bonus is 22%, and whenever they are getting damage while berserking on their gear or on their paragons, that current bonus right here is also going to go up. So not only are you going to have a maybe new bis stat depending on which legendary node you're going to take, but also every gear piece is going to be worth more for not only another class, but maybe even for another build. So you might actually see a Whirlwind Barb needing damage while berserking, and another Whirlwind Barb didn't even specialize into that at all, because they took another legendary node, basically scaling their damage in a different way. Unfortunately, we don't have all of these examples ready at the moment. I don't know why Blizzard hasn't released them all at once. Maybe that would have been a little bit overwhelming. The downside to this is that we have to find this stuff out as soon as the season launches, because whenever you are opening up your skill tree, you're actually going to see the changes, and they're going to be on all type of things. As we have seen, we will see them on Keystone passives. We will also see them on legendary nodes. So these are going to be a special way of scaling your damage in your build. And this has not been done before. I'm really curious how that is going to work out. It sounds nice on paper. I'm really hyped to try this out as soon as the season starts on the 17th. And yeah, I'm going to be streaming live on Twitch. If you want to join me and see how I'm going to try and tackle the hardcore solo self-found race, the Twitch link is going to be down in the pinned comment. And if you like content similar to this, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, and I'll see you next time.